The dust never really settles in a town like Redemption. It just gets kicked up again, coating old wounds and fresh graves. For Jacob, riding back was like tasting ash in his mouth. He'd left years ago, vowing never to return. But a promise is a stubborn thing, heavier than any saddlebag. The promise was to Elias, his best friend, a man now lying cold in the ground, leaving behind a wife, Clara, and a ranch teetering on the edge of ruin. Clara stood on her porch, a silhouette against the harsh sun, rifle held loosely in her hands. Her eyes, once bright with laughter, were now shadowed with grief and fear. She didn't have to say much. The story was etched on her face, in the tense line of her jaw. Elias wasn't just ambushed, he was murdered. And the local sheriff? Well, his badge was more decoration than a symbol of justice. He called it a robbery gone wrong, a case closed as quickly as it was opened. Jacob knew better. Elias wasn't the type to be caught off guard. He was a good man, a smart rancher, but he'd made enemies. The kind of enemies who don't just take your cattle. They take your life. Jacob unsaddled his horse, the creak of leather, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. He looked at Clara, at the home she and Elias had built from nothing, and he knew his promise was just beginning. He wasn't just here to comfort a widow. He was here to hunt. His investigation started where all troubles in Redemption began. The saloon. The air was thick with cheap whiskey and unspoken threats. Men watched him over the rims of their glasses, their hands never straying far from their holsters. Jacob wasn't looking for a fight, not yet. He was listening. Names were whispered like curses. Blackwood, a land grabber with a heart as barren as the desert itself. He'd been trying to buy out Elias for months, wanting his water rights. Elias, stubborn as a mule, had refused every offer. Jacob found one of Blackwood's men, a jittery fella named Slim, trying to drink away his conscience. A little pressure, a few pointed questions about the night Elias died, and Slim started to crack. His eyes darted around the room, sweat beading on his forehead. He didn't confess, not outright, but his fear was a confession in itself. He spoke of a business deal gone south, of Blackwood's impatience. Jacob had his first thread. He spent the next few days riding the fences of Clara's ranch, checking for tracks, for signs of anything out of place. He found them near the creek where Elias was found. Boot prints, too many for just one man. And a spent cartridge, a different caliber from the one Elias carried. It was a planned execution. The sheriff hadn't even bothered to look. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about sending a message. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a rider approached the ranch. Not one of Blackwood's thugs, but a young ranch hand who used to work for Elias. He'd been fired a week before the murder. He told Jacob he'd overheard Blackwood talking to his foreman, a ruthless man named Cutter. They were celebrating. "One down, one to go," Cutter had said, laughing. The boy was terrified, but his loyalty to Elias outweighed his fear. The target wasn't just the land anymore. It was Clara. Jacob's blood ran cold. They weren't just going to scare her off. They were going to eliminate the last obstacle. He pieced it all together. Blackwood hired Cutter and his men to kill Elias. Now, with the law in his pocket, he was coming to finish the job, to take the ranch and silence the only witness. He had underestimated Clara, and he had definitely underestimated the man who had come back to protect her. That night, Jacob didn't sleep. He cleaned his Colt, the familiar weight a grim comfort in his hands. He checked his rifle, oiled the action until it was smooth as silk. He was no longer just an investigator. He was an instrument of vengeance, the answer to a promise made to a dead friend. He looked over at Clara, asleep in a chair by the cold hearth, her face softened in the moonlight. He was all that stood between her and them. Before the first light of dawn painted the sky, Jacob was in the saddle. He didn't wait Clara. He couldn't. This was his fight. He wrote a short note, leaving it on the table. It just said, "Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." He knew Blackwood and Cutter wouldn't expect him to ride out to meet them. They'd expect him to wait, to cower behind the walls of the cabin. But Jacob wasn't the kind to wait for the storm to hit. He rode into it. He rode towards Blackwood's ranch, a lone figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The air was still pregnant with the violence to come. This wasn't just for Elias anymore. It was for every rancher Blackwood had bullied, for every man the corrupt sheriff had failed. It was for Clara, for her future, for the peace she deserved. As he crested the last ridge overlooking Blackwood's property, he saw them. 5 men, including Cotter, saddling up, rifles in their scabbards. They were heading for Clara's. He was just in time. Jacob dismounted, leading his horse behind a cluster of rocks. He took a deep breath, the desert air cool and sharp. He wasn't a hero, he was just a man with a promise to keep. And as he raised his rifle, taking aim, he knew that by sunrise, redemption would live up to its name. One way or another. Thanks for watching our story unfold. If you enjoy tales of the Old West, of justice and honor, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think Jacob should do. We'll see you in the next one. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the world with icy claws. Rain fell in sheets, blurring the line between earth and sky into a gray, churning chaos. Through it all, one man rode on. Jacob Reed wasn't running from the storm. He was riding into its heart, a lone figure against the fury of nature and the malice of men. The riders behind him were phantoms in the mist, their shouts swallowed by the thunder, but their intent was as clear as the lightning that ripped across the sky. He clutched his side, where a fresh wound burned, a grim reminder of why he couldn't stop, why he couldn't turn back. Every painful mile he put between himself and the small cabin was a shield for her. He wasn't riding to escape his past. He was riding to lead death away from her door. Back at the cabin, Clara's world had shrunk to the 4 log walls and the sound of her own ragged breathing. The storm outside was a monster trying to claw its way in, rattling the windows and moaning through the chimney. But the real monster she feared was already here. She gripped the cold steel of the Winchester. The stock pressed hard against her shoulder, its weight a small comfort in the suffocating darkness. Her knuckles were white, her eyes wide, darting towards the windows where the lantern light cast dancing, distorted shadows. Every creak of the old cabin was a footstep. Every gust of wind was a whisper. The world was holding its breath, and she was at its epicenter. She had told Jacob to leave, to not come back. A part of her prayed he had listened. Another, smaller part, prayed he hadn't. Then, a shadow detached itself from the others, growing larger, more defined. It stopped right outside her door. A sharp, confident knock echoed through the small space, making her jump. It wasn't the frantic pounding of someone seeking shelter from the storm. It was deliberate, calm. She held her breath, the rifle sight wavering as she aimed it at the door. The knock came again, followed by a voice, smooth as oil but with an edge that cut right through the noise of the wind. "Clara? You in there?" "It's Cal Brenner. Heard you might have some trouble. Came to see if you needed a hand." The name hit her like a physical blow. Cal Brenner. A name from her husband's past, a name spoken only in hushed, fearful tones, a name synonymous with trouble. The doorknob began to turn. Miles away, the chase was ending. Jacob's horse, exhausted and spooked, stumbled in the thick mud. The brief moment was all his pursuers needed. They closed the distance, their dark shapes surrounding him like wolves. Jacob wheeled his horse around, his hand reaching for his colt, but he was too slow, too weak. A muzzle flash cut through the torrential rain, a bright orange star against the gloom. The sound of the shot was lost in a clap of thunder, but the impact was undeniable. A fiery pain exploded in his shoulder, and the world tilted violently. He fell from the saddle, crashing into the cold, unforgiving mud. Rough hands grabbed him, hauling him up. Through the haze of pain and rain, he saw their faces hard, cruel, and victorious. They had him, and that meant Clara was alone. The cabin door didn't just open. It exploded inward, splintering off its hinges with a sickening crack. Cal Brenner stood there, framed by the raging storm, that polite smile now twisted into a predatory smirk. Behind him, 2 more men pushed their way in, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hats. Clara didn't hesitate. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. One of the men cried out and fell back, clutching his leg. But before she could chamber another round, Brenner was on her. He moved with a speed that defied his size, knocking the rifle from her hands. She fought back, kicking and clawing like a cornered animal, but it was useless. He was too strong. He shoved her hard against the wall, her head striking the logs with a dull thud. The room spun, the light from the lantern blurring into streaks as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Just as her consciousness began to fade, the doorway filled again. But this wasn't one of Brenner's men. It was Jacob, He stood there, soaked to the bone, mud-caked and bleeding from 2 wounds, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. For a heartbeat everyone froze, then all hell broke loose. Jacob launched himself at the nearest man with a guttural roar, the sound of a man who had nothing left to lose. It wasn't a fight. It was a storm of its own. Fists met flesh with brutal, sickening thuds. A table was overturned, sending plates and cutlery crashing to the floor. The fight was raw, desperate, and bloody. Jacob moved like a man possessed, ignoring his injuries, driven by a single burning purpose. He dropped one man with a vicious right hook, then turned on the other, driving him back towards the broken door. For a moment, it seemed impossible, but he was winning. He was clearing a path to her. He finally threw the last of Brenner's men out into the storm and turned, his chest heaving, his eyes locking on Clara. Relief, fierce and overwhelming, washed over him. But it was premature. In that split second, Cal Brenner moved. He lunged for Clara, pulling her back and spinning her around to use as a shield. The cold, flat blade of a hunting knife pressed against the soft skin of her throat. "That's enough, Reed," Brenner hissed, his voice dangerously calm. Jacob froze, every muscle in his body screaming to attack, but held in check by the glint of steel at Clara's neck. Outside, another sound cut through the storm, the frantic whinny of horses and a man's voice shouting, "Brenner! This is Sheriff Miller. Drop the knife and come out with your hands up." Brenner's smirk widened. He looked from the knife at Clara's throat, to the terror in her eyes, and finally to the agony on Jacob's face. He was trapped, but he held all the cards. And in that moment, Jacob Reed understood. Redemption sometimes costs more than a man is ready to pay. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you're subscribed for part 3. You won't want to miss it. The air was a razor's edge, thick with the smell of rain and blood. Brenner's knife pressed cold against Clara's throat, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Across the rain-soaked mud, Jacob lay wounded, his strength bleeding out onto the unforgiving earth. And there, standing firm against the gale, was Sheriff Miller, his rifle steady, its sight fixed on the man holding Clara's life in his hands. Every raindrop felt like a ticking clock, each second an eternity. The storm howled, a chorus to their desperate standoff. "Let her go, Brenner," Jacob grunted, pushing himself up on one elbow, his voice strained. "It's me you want." Brenner just laughed, a sound as harsh as grinding stone. "You think I'm a fool, Jacob? She's my ticket out of this mess. You made this mess." The sheriff's voice cut through the wind. "Don't do it, Brenner. There's no way out." But Brenner's eyes were wild, cornered. He wasn't listening to reason. He was listening to the chaos in his own soul. He tightened his grip on Clara, and a small whimper escaped her lips. That sound, that tiny sliver of her fear, seemed to sever the last thread holding Jacob's past in the shadows. He knew what he had to do. He had to give the law something it wanted more than a small-time thug like Brenner. He had to give it himself. "Sheriff!" Jacob called out, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "Miller, listen to me. Brenner's nothing. He's just a symptom. I'm the disease." He took a ragged breath, the words tasting like ash. "The bank robbery in '08, that was me. The payroll wagon that got hit on the old canyon road. That was me and my crew. I'm the one you've been hunting for years. The ghost." Clara's eyes widened, staring at Jacob. The man she knew, the quiet hand who had mended her fences and soothed her horses, was this notorious outlaw? The confession hung in the air, heavier than the storm clouds overhead. The sheriff didn't move, his gaze unwavering. "You're lying, Jacob, trying to buy her time." "Am I?" Jacob retorted, a pained, bitter smile on his face. "Ask yourself, Sheriff. Does a simple farmhand know how to track a man through a blizzard? Does he know how to fight like his life depends on it? I've got a bounty on my head big enough to buy this whole county. Let her go, Brenner, and you can walk away. The sheriff gets his real prize. He gets me." For a moment, greed flickered in Brenner's eyes. The idea of walking away free was tempting. But his hatred for Jacob ran deeper. "No," he snarled, pressing the knife harder. "I want to see him watch you die first. That was his mistake." In that instant, as Brenner shifted his focus, his intention clear, the world exploded in a deafening crack. It wasn't thunder. It was the sheriff's rifle. A blossom of red bloomed on Brenner's chest. His eyes went wide with shock, the cruel smile frozen on his face. The knife clattered harmlessly to the ground as he crumpled, his life extinguished by the storm and a single well-aimed bullet. Clara stumbled forward, gasping for air, her hand flying to her throat where the ghost of the blade remained. Her eyes found Jacob, and the relief that flooded her was immediately replaced by terror. With the danger gone, the adrenaline that had sustained him vanished. Jacob slumped to the ground, his face pale, the darkness at the edge of his vision closing in. He was done. "Jacob!" Clara screamed, scrambling through the mud to his side. She cradled his head in her lap, her tears mingling with the rain on his face. "Stay with me. Don't you dare leave me." She pressed her hands against his wound, trying to will the blood to stop, to hold his life inside him. His eyes fluttered open, finding hers. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I'm sorry." The sheriff walked over, his rifle held loosely at his side. He looked down at the scene, at the repentant outlaw and the woman who loved him. His expression was grim, a mixture of duty and something that looked a lot like pity. "He needs a doctor," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "But after that, he's under arrest." Clara looked up, defiance in her tear-filled eyes. "He saved my life." "He did," Miller agreed softly, "and I won't forget that. But the law's the law," he confessed. "The past always collects its dues." Jacob didn't fight it. He didn't argue. As the deputies helped him onto a horse, his head bowed in acceptance. He met Clara's gaze one last time, a silent promise passing between them, a promise that this wasn't the end. He had finally faced the man he was, and in doing so, he had become the man she needed him to be. He willingly rode away into the fading storm, toward justice and the consequences he had run from for so long. The years that followed were quiet. The ranch, once a place of tense survival, became a sanctuary of patient healing. Clara managed it alone, her strength forged in loss and tempered by hope. The rhythm of her days was marked by the seasons, the hard work, and the letters. They arrived once a month, paper-thin ghosts from a world of stone walls and iron bars. Jacob's handwriting, rough at first, grew steadier over time. He wrote of the silence, of the time he had to think, to unravel the knots of his past. He never made excuses. He wrote of regret, of the man he was learning to be without a gun in his hand. Clara wrote back, her letters filled with the life he was missing. Her words were his window to the world, his anchor to a future he hoped he might one day deserve. Through ink and paper, across miles and years, they rebuilt a connection, one honest word at a time. Then, one late autumn afternoon, a decade after the storm, a figure appeared on the long road leading to the ranch. He was older, leaner, the harsh lines on his face softened by time and reflection. His steps were slow, deliberate, no longer the stride of a man on the run, but of a man walking home. Clara was on the porch, mending a leather strap, when she saw him, her hands stilled. She stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on the approaching figure, not daring to believe it until he was close enough for her to see the familiar, tired hope in his eyes. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his hat in his hands. He looked at her, at the home she had maintained, at the life that had waited for him. No grand words were needed. All the years of waiting, of hoping, of healing, were held in that single, shared gaze. She simply nodded, a small, welcoming smile gracing her lips, and stepped aside. He walked up the steps and sat in the empty rocking chair beside hers. They didn't speak for a long time, just sat together, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the world in a gentle, forgiving light. The long storm was finally over. The widow once said, "Don't come back." But the storm took what was broken, and returned what was finally worthy of staying. Jacob Reed woke to silence. Not the empty kind that haunted cabins at night, but the gentle stillness that followed a storm's passing. The rain was gone. The wind had softened. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifted its weight and snorted quietly. Pain returned in waves, his shoulder burned, his ribs ached, but he was alive. He opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Clara. She sat beside the bed, hands folded in her lap, eyes red from crying yet steady now. Morning light slipped through the cabin window, touching her face in a way that made her look older and stronger. "You're still here," she said softly. Jacob tried to speak. His throat was dry. "Looks like it." A faint smile trembled at the corner of her mouth before she caught herself. "The doctor said you're stubborn," she said. Said men like you either die quick or refuse to. Jacob exhaled slowly. Figures. Outside, boots crunched on gravel. Sheriff Wilkes stepped into the doorway, hat in hand, his expression heavy but respectful. Cal Brenner's men scattered by sunrise, the sheriff said. One dead, one wounded and taken in. The rest won't be back. Clara nodded. Justice Imperfect Delayed had finally found its way to Red Willow Crossing. Wilkes then looked at Jacob. There's something else. Jacob didn't look away. He'd been expecting this. I know, he said. I won't run. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. You saved her life. That counts. Jacob shook his head slightly. Doesn't erase what I did before, Wilkes sighed. No, it doesn't. Silence settled again. I'm placing you under arrest, the sheriff finally said. For crimes committed years ago. Things I can't ignore. Clara's breath caught. Jacob reached for her hand, squeezing gently. It's all right. She searched his face. You don't have to. Yes, he said quietly. I do, because redemption wasn't surviving the storm. It was accepting what came after. They took Jacob away 2 days later. The town watched as he mounted the sheriff's horse, hands bound, shoulders squared despite the pain. No one jeered. No one cheered. They simply watched a man ride out not as an outlaw, not as a hero, but as someone finally facing himself. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, the same place she'd stood during the storm. This time she didn't tell him not to come back. She didn't say anything at all. Jacob looked at her once before turning away, memorizing the sight like a photograph he'd carry through dark years. Time passed the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission. Seasons turned. Clara learned how to run the ranch alone. She fixed fences. She learned which storms to respect and which to endure. Some nights were lonelier than others, but she discovered something unexpected in the solitude. Strength. Letters began to arrive after the first year. Jacob's handwriting was careful, restrained. He never asked her to wait. He never promised anything. He wrote about working the prison fields. About sunrise over unfamiliar ground. About learning patience the hard way. About regret, not dramatic, not self-pitying but honest. Clara wrote back, at first briefly, then longer. They wrote about the land. About memory. About the quiet ways people change when no one is watching. Years passed. The day Jacob Reed returned, there was no storm. The sky was wide and blue. The plains rolled gently beneath the afternoon sun. A lone rider approached the cabin slowly, as if unsure he was welcome. Jacob dismounted at the fence line. He looked older, leaner. The fire in him hadn't gone out, but it had been tempered into something steadier. He stopped there, not crossing the boundary. Clara stepped onto the porch. They looked at each other for a long time. You came back, she finally said. Only because you never told me not to, he replied. She considered that. Then she walked down the steps and opened the gate. That was all the permission he needed. They didn't speak of the past much, they didn't need to. Some evenings, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sun sink into the plains. No grand declarations, no dramatic vows. Just the quiet understanding of two people who had survived loss and chosen something better than bitterness. Jacob helped around the ranch. Clara laughed again softly at first, then freely. Love, when it returned, did so gently, not like a storm, like dawn. And sometimes, when the wind passed through the tall grass just right, Clara would remember the night she told a broken man not to come back, how he rode into the storm anyway, how he faced what he'd been, how he returned not unchanged but finally worthy of staying. Because the West didn't give second chances easily, but every once in a while, it let a man earn one.